It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome into another edition of Locked On NFL Sunday. We appreciate you very much being here with us after a couple of weeks away. Cody and I are back for the off season. You know, we don't sleep out here. We enjoy what we do. We have a fun time, of course. So as always, you've got Cody Roark here at Cody Roark NFL on Twitter, and myself, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola. We got a lot to talk about today. We're going to be going through Wilson and Watson, everything going on with the quarterback carousel across the NFL, including Matt Stafford-Jared Goff, the trades, Carson Wentz on the move, where's J.J. Watt going? And Cody had a great conversation with the man, the myth, the legend, Ian Rapoport as well over at Locked On Broncos. So he's going to tell us a little bit about that conversation, not just from the Broncos lens, but also a couple of things across the NFL. So we got a ton to talk about today. Cody, how are you, man? It's a pleasure to be back with you.
Hey, man, it's been 2 weeks. 2 weeks has felt like forever since we've been here on Locked On NFL Sunday, man, but always good to be back. You know, in season, we have you covered with the latest stuff on pregame notes, the best matchup coverages possible with our local experts. And in the offseason, we have you covered with what's going on around the NFL landscape. And we're also going to bring our local experts on for that as well. But, Ross, always a pleasure to jump on here on Sundays, my friend.
Yes, absolutely. Of course, you can catch Cody every Monday through Friday over at Locked On Broncos, myself every Monday through Friday over at Locked On Saints, as well as Tuesdays over at Locked On NFL. It's just going to be Cody and I today. We never get to do episodes just us, so we thought, hey, as we get the offseason rolling, let's go ahead and chop it up and have a good time. So we're here not only to talk about our topics, but also talk about your topics. We've already got a couple of questions saved up from some comments on our Twitter post. But as always, you can also drop any questions or comments that you have in the chat wherever it is that you're watching, whether it's on Twitch, YouTube, Periscope, or Facebook. We'll see them here in the chat and then bring them up so that we can get your comments and your questions answered. We'll probably save questions toward the end of today's show. Going to run for about an hour or so as we usually do. But let's go ahead and get started with our first topic here today. Oh, and let me also remind everybody as well that regardless of who your favorite team is, NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, or college, we've got you covered here at the Locked On Podcast Network. So just search Locked On and whatever your favorite team name is or favorite school is, all of that, and we'll have you covered here at Locked On NFL, Locked On College, everywhere. We got it all covered here, Cody.
Yeah, we do. I mean, it's a sports fan's dream. You know, we feature the local experts on the biggest stories. I think that's always one of the biggest things because we have fans that support some teams. You know, for example, we had a fan that, you know, supports the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that lives all the way in California and doesn't get that coverage of California. So he turns on Locked On Bucks, hosted by, you know, James and David, and then he gets that access as to what's going on in the local market. That's what we do here at the Locked On Podcast Network. So it's special. But, Ross, the NFL offseason, there's already some crazy storylines, and we haven't even gotten into the new league year yet.
That's right, man. We're not even there yet, but we're well on the way. Just a reminder, as before we get to our first topic here, the NFL league year begins officially on March 17th. So we're not far away. We're a little bit more than 2 weeks away from free agency opening. The franchise tag period is open right now. March 15th is the legal tampering period where teams can start talking and players can start agreeing to contracts on principle. And then on the 17th, ink goes to paper and the free agency frenzy begins. But before we get to that, there's still so many stories to cover. So let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to start off with our first story here, probably the biggest story going on right now. 4 teams have been named as Russell Wilson's preferred trade destination if indeed he is traded. Now, it's pretty key here that we reference and make sure that, you know, we say that he hasn't specifically asked to be traded. Is that right, Cody?
Yeah, that's correct. So what happened was Russell Wilson entering this offseason, he said that he wants more organizational input. He wants to be able to provide suggestions that will help the team win. Mm-hmm. And he gave those suggestions actually during the season. The organization dismissed them. He walked out of that meeting, according to multiple media reports. I think Mike Sando of The Athletic did a phenomenal job kind of telling the backstory as to what was going on there. But at this point in time, Russell Wilson, like you mentioned, has not demanded a trade. He is not looking to be traded. However, if the organization does deem that they are going to trade him, which is a big if, I don't think it's going to happen, then those are the 4 preferred destinations altogether that maybe he would be interested in going to.
Yeah, absolutely. So those 4 teams as of right now, as you can see listed below: Chicago Bears, Las Vegas Raiders, New Orleans Saints, and Dallas Cowboys. At an earlier point, as this was all sort of coming together, the New York Jets and the Miami Dolphins were also named. But as we got more information from Adam Schefter and sort of getting an idea about the names that the agents were putting out there, these are the 4 teams that were named. So these are the 4 teams that we'll ride with for right now. Now, you've already sort of mentioned, and I feel the same way, that Russell Wilson probably won't get traded. It seems very likely that he'll still be a Seattle Seahawk next year, but we'll see what happens. That week 11 situation was a big one before that Thursday night game against the Arizona Cardinals, which they did win, but they had to fight tooth and nail to get there, the 28-21 victory there against Arizona. And then after the Super Bowl, sort of more conversations that went sideways about the offensive line, concerns around the offensive line, all these other things. And of course, we always talk about letting Russ cook. Maybe there's some concerns about Russ wanting to cook as well. So out of these 4 landing spots, if Russell Wilson is traded, let's talk first about best fit, and then we'll get to which one seems to be the most realistic option in terms of trade capital and everything like that. What do you feel like is the best fit for Russell Wilson out of these 4 teams?
You know, when I look at these 4 teams, I don't see the appeal in Chicago, maybe outside of the fact that they have some very phenomenal defensive players. You know, Allen Robinson, the whole situation, they got to figure out his contract there, what they're going to do in terms of an extension. But Chicago seems like the least appealing of the 4 4 targets there. You know, part of me, I'm looking at New Orleans. New Orleans would be ideal. I know you'd like that as well if that was the case.
I wouldn't mind.
But, you know, part of me is thinking the Las Vegas Raiders seems the most appealing if we look at personnel and that offensive line. I mean, that is an offensive line that they can run the football really well with Josh Jacobs. And they have so much talent on the offensive side of the ball with Hunter Renfrow, Darren Waller, Henry Ruggs. I mean, they have guys galore there that Russell Wilson can throw the ball to. Imagine Russell Wilson cooking with a guy, obviously like Darren Waller. So I think in terms of protection, I think that would be great. That'd make the AFC West even tougher. But outside of that, Dallas, I mean, you look at Dallas, that division is always appealing. I have a hard time seeing Russell Wilson in any conference besides the NFC. I don't know if he's going to go to an AFC team if he were to be traded. So it'd be between Dallas and New Orleans, in my opinion. I think those 2 would have to slug it out as to who's the most appealing. And we know that Sean Payton is a player's coach. And I think that right there probably makes New Orleans probably the most appealing in terms of maybe a preferred fit for Russell Wilson.
Yeah, we've always heard from Russell Wilson with his stature that Drew Brees is somebody that he sort of modeled his game after, outside of course, his mobility and the natural additional talent that he brings. But in terms of, you know, being a thrower, being a quarterback, he modeled a good portion of his game after Drew Brees. He and Drew Brees have been close before. He stepped back a couple of years ago to allow Drew Brees to have that starting role in the Pro Bowl when people were sort of figuring that he was going to retire before last year. So there's already been a lot of connection there between the 2 teams, just sort of, you know, indirectly. But I feel like there is an argument in favor of Dallas in terms of their in terms of what they can also give, right? Because you have the sign and trade or tag and trade option with Dak Prescott. While I feel like New Orleans is probably the best fit, what do we feel like is going to be able to offer maybe the most realistic trade capital to be able to land them?
Well, we know the New Orleans Saints' history of not having really many first-round picks altogether. I think that kind of impacts them in a sense. Right. Dallas, however, you know, I think it would have to be a really hard sell. What is the 5-year plan for Dallas to, you know, a guy like Russell Wilson? You know, I think ultimately it would command 3 first-round picks. I think absolutely. I think that if Deshaun Watson is going for 3 first-round picks, 2 2s and 2 3s, you have to throw in 3 first-rounders for Russ. I mean, you could factor in the age difference there, and maybe that could be an argument for leverage. But ideally, I would say that it would probably acquire for the Seattle Seahawks. They'd have to acquire a key defensive player, and also they'd have to be getting a pretty darn good offensive player in return. Now, you mentioned there is the tag. I mean, maybe they could include Dak Prescott there, but ultimately, I think that Russell Wilson has the final say because there's no trade clause. He could say, no, I'm not going there. Even if you want to send me there, I'm not going. So I don't know. I don't know if Dak would want to go to Seattle either. So it's just one of those situations. Like, what can they offer there? I mean, ideally, I think that they'd probably be asking for a defensive player and an offensive player in regards to that. But right now, it's so hard to determine. I mean, if Jamal Adams can get what he got, I mean, who knows what it's going to be for a franchise quarterback?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the wild part about all this too, is that you can look comparatively across some other quarterback trades, but also some non-quarterback trades for some of the teams that have been involved in these talks, and you kind of get an idea that, hey, it's going to be a pretty hefty price tag. We've already heard that 3 first-round picks seems to be pretty much the sort of, let's say, starting point or base point to where you start. Not often does a trade actually happen to where the compensation ends up being what the early expectation was, but this time you're moving away a franchise quarterback that's going to give you around 5 or so, if potentially more than that, years of stellar quarterback play wherever you're going. So if you trade away a first round pick to pretty much any of these teams outside of maybe Chicago, you're looking at a late first round pick that you're getting back for all of that. So there's a ton of those different conversations that are going on. I'm curious to know what the Las Vegas Raiders would put on the table if they would put those 3 first round picks and then a Derek Carr or a Marcus Mariota that they could end up moving on from, and then end up moving the other guy as well. There's a lot of potential compensation that could come from Las Vegas, as well as potentially a good defensive starter as well. I feel like they have maybe the largest or maybe the best trade package to offer outside of Dak Prescott, if that were actually an option for the Dallas Cowboys. And of course, that would be really appealing to Seattle to get him out of the conference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It totally would. And Las Vegas, knowing John Gruden, knowing Mike Mayock, they would sit together and they'd say, look, man, we have a chance to get Russell Wilson, man. This is one of the most prolific quarterbacks in the National Football League. If you let him cook, he can take you to the Highlands. And you want to find a way for the Raiders too. You want to find a way to compete with Patrick Mahomes and Kansas City Chiefs. Now, however, in 2020, the Raiders actually did that. They beat them once on the road in Arrowhead. They had a shootout in Las Vegas in a very entertaining game. So defensively, I think the Raiders' issue is on defense. Does Russell Wilson want to go to a situation where the defense is, bad, or if not worse than what it was in Seattle, essentially? That right there, I think, is the hold-up point. But when you look at the offensive line, you want to protect him. Maybe Russell Wilson's okay with that, right? Because I think at the end of the day, Russ wants to have protection on the O-line. One of his concerns in terms of having that organizational input is how can we improve the offensive line to where I'm not taking all these shots? And I think at the end of the day, the Raiders probably offensive line-wise are probably the most appealing.
Could be. I don't know. I'm just trying to get Russ to come over and cook some gumbo. That's what I'm all about. I'm all about.
he would like it. And I tell you what, he'd be a great addition. And here's the flip side too. The New Orleans Saints, we just saw them. Now, cap concerns aside, I imagine they're going to manage that and they're going to work everything out here. But ideally, they have arguably the better defense of the 4. Of Chicago, of the Raiders, and obviously of the Cowboys. So that's also appealing. And you have weapons. You have Alvin Kamara. Come on, Russell Wilson, Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas, maybe Emmanuel Sanders if you bring him back. I think that, I don't know, Sean Payton, show him the money. That's
what I'm saying. Show him the money and get Chris Richard out there to talk to him. But hey, you remember Legion of Boom? Remember Legion of Boom? Well, I'm here now, so why don't you come through? So there's a lot you can dangle.
I posed a very interesting question to Sean Payton this week on social media. I added him and I said, Coach, a few years ago, you had the chance to sign Ricky Jarrett to a deal and he wasn't feeling the love. How come you didn't do that? So that's a Ballers reference for those of you that watch HBO's Ballers, Ricky Jarrett and Sean Payton, man. But they should have made that deal happen.
That should have happened. It should have happened. All right, let's move over to our next one here. We're not straying too far away from the quarterback carousel just yet because there's a ton of news across the NFL dealing with quarterbacks. Maybe more so than usual, or at least it's louder than usual at this point. Yeah. But, I'm sure we'll embark on that conversation here in a bit. But where will Houston Texans quarterback Deshaun Watson play in 2021? Watson remains intent per reports of not playing in Houston. There were some reports that he had met with the new head coach there, Dave Culley, and mentioned that he's not playing. He has no intent on playing for the Houston Texans. And the Houston Texans, on the other hand, as reported by Ian Rapoport, who we'll be talking a little bit later on, seem that they're not intent on trading him at this time either, or at any time. So where does this sort of game of chicken end at this point? Do you think that Houston ends up potentially finally moving Watson at some point, or where does Watson play next year?
I don't think Watson gets traded in 2021. I think he gets traded after this season. That's my thought process here. And, according to the reports that have been put out there, Watson is willing to sit. However, I don't think he's willing to sit the entire season. If he sat the entire season, I believe the number that I saw is he'd lose out $20 million. But he also loses out if he sits at the entire season in accrued season on his contract. So I imagine probably around week 9, week 10, he could report to the Houston Texans, play, unite with his teammates. But then after that, I think they can trade him. And I think that's exactly what we're going to see. I don't think that there's going to be too many teams. I know there's going to be teams that are willing to, But the Houston Texans are adamant that they are not trading him. And I think that they're trying to say that, look, the organization has control of the situation. We're in power here, which this is a back and forth tug of war between the NFL, the NFLPA, the players versus, teams and organizations. We're seeing Deshaun Watson kind of change the game here, essentially.
Right.
But the thing that I look at altogether is you have to find a way to find that overall balance. And I don't know if the Houston Texans are going to just sit on their hands all season. I imagine they will. I mean, that's what they're doing right now. It's even resorted to the point where they're leaving voicemails. Teams are leaving voicemails on the Houston Texans with trade offers. They're not listening.
That's one of my favorite things.
It's a crazy situation.
It's like it's just the only thing that's on the voicemail when they call is like beep, no, and then they have to leave a message. You know what I mean? And
that would be perfect.
Leave a message after the beep, like that's it. But yeah, I do think that there's something to be said here that Watson having a very clear understanding of what the CBA is, having a very clear understanding of what the contract is, does allow him to have a little bit more leverage in this situation. I think the no trade clause plays a part, just like with Russell Wilson, but only to an extent, right? Like you can only say yes or no to the trades that the team are willing to take. Like that's the biggest part of it. You might say, "Oh, I don't want to go to this team," or "I will go to this team." But if the only two teams that your team is willing to take a trade from are the New York Jets and the Chicago Bears, for instance, those are your choices, right? It's either that or you end up sitting out. And it got tougher. Like the holdout idea got a lot tougher for teams. Got a lot tougher for players. Not reporting to off-season workouts. There's large fines there. Per game, per week checks end up being revoked, and fines that get placed on top of that, and all these other things. Your point about the accrued season, though, is really important, because if he doesn't play, I think it's the 6 games in the season, or more than 6 games in the season, he doesn't get that accrued season, and therefore his contract kind of tolls into next year, and he's kind of in the exact same spot as he is this year, next year. And that makes him tough to trade. That makes it tough for him to have to move on. It puts him in the exact same position. So that would be a smart decision by him, essentially saying, I'm only going to put myself at risk for this team to a certain extent and protect my trade ability for next season if the Houston Texans don't finally break and agree to trade him at some point.
Well, and I think we're all in agreement here too. I think we can all sit here and say, look, the Houston Texans situation right now is absolutely terrible. I mean, for any player that has seen what has gone on in that franchise, the trading of DeAndre Hopkins, not even notifying Deshaun Watson that, hey, we're trading your number one wide receiver away. The disconnect with obviously Bill O'Brien, they obviously got rid of him, but the situation with Jack Easterby is becoming very concerning as each day passes. And obviously Cal McNair at the beginning of the offseason, being able to say, hey, look, we're going to give you some input as to the coaching hiring. We want you to have a say in it. They didn't contact him. So obviously that's where Deshaun Watson, is talking about loyalty. Loyalty is everything. But here's the deal. As much as I believe that Deshaun Watson deserves to get out of the Houston Texans, what team is going to do it? And, is the Houston Texans going to do it, for example?
Right.
I don't think we're going to see the situation where there's not going to be teams, like I mentioned earlier, that aren't going to inquire. But the thing that I'm worried about the most here is Houston going to be stubborn enough with the whole dynamic of that leadership situation right now where they're like, we don't care if you sit out. We don't care if that we're going to go out there, we're going to fill the football team, we're going to get first-round picks. And then if we have to trade you next year, we could get even more for you. And they could just stockpile. So I think Houston is going to be sitting in a position of power here. And it's unfortunate, but Deshaun Watson does deserve better.
Yeah. I think that we agree that that on that point, and also that players need a little bit more power. Yeah. You know what I mean? I really do think that that's the case. I really do think that that's the case. But, look, maybe sometimes you ask for trades and you don't get them. Other times you ask for, trades, or you and your organization come to an agreement at some point. And hopefully that happens with Deshaun Watson. It certainly would happen with our next topic as we move along here. But real quick, just want to remind everybody to, first of all, thank you very much for being here with us. Love seeing all the folks that are here. Don't forget to drop your questions and comments in the chat. We'll get to questions toward the end of the show. And then also make sure you check out your favorite team here at the Locked On Podcast Network. You can find the entire list of shows at LockedOnPodcasts.com. You can also throw a follow to us on Twitter at Ross Jackson-Nola, at Cody Roark NFL. We appreciate you very much for being here. And of course, make sure you keep up with everything going on over here at the Locked On NFL channel with at Locked On NFL Pods on Twitter as well. So, Cody, let's go ahead and jump into our next topic here. Matthew Stafford and the Detroit Lions. Last time we talked, they agreed that they were going to head their separate ways. Now we know exactly how that all played out. Matthew Stafford traded to the Los Angeles Rams, Jared Goff heading in that trade to the Detroit Lions, along with 2021 third round pick, and then 2 first round picks in the future, 2022 and 2023. So let's talk a little bit about how this impacts the NFC, the NFL, and all parties involved. Let's start off with the parties involved. Who wins this trade? Who are the winners, if you will, in this move?
Oh, it's a tough situation, really. I mean, I feel like when we look at it, and I already know your answer, so I'm not going to say it. So I'm going to come up with my own here.
All good.
I feel like the Rams, in a sense, won this trade. Now, how much of a risk versus reward factor is it, right? I mean, Matthew Stafford, when we look at him as one of the most durable quarterbacks because of the fact that he gets so banged up, he plays through injuries. I mean, the amount of injuries and the extent of what he gets hurt by, and to still hear him playing on Sundays, you have to applaud that. We've seen him. He's a very tough guy. However, the salary cap situation, he's coming into a situation where the defense for LA is top ranked. Now, what are they going to look like without Brandon Staley, who left them after one season to become a head coach? So that's, you have the personnel there, but are you going to have the same play calling experience? You're going to have the same defensive scheme. You have to give Matthew Stafford some weapons on offense. I just don't know if the Rams have that. I mean, outside of Cooper Kupp, I don't know if they have consistent enough targets. But then again, Matthew Stafford's been used to that lately. So maybe he can make something out of that. I think obviously Cooper Kupp's probably one of the better wide receivers he's had in quite some time. I think LA is probably in a better situation, but for the Lions, I also want to throw it to that angle. They're in rebuild mode. They're kind of going through this whole change now. Is Jared Goff the guy to rebuild with? I mean, I feel like it's great to enter a situation where you have Jared Goff as your quarterback that you're rebuilding with in comparison to some guy that you've never ever heard of or a guy that's been a second string journeyman his whole life. So I think there's positives for both sides.
Yeah, it also gives you kind of a known commodity, right, to work with over the next couple of years before you embark on the unknown with potentially a rookie quarterback. And so it's always nice to have at least that guy that has played in the NFL as a bridge. They're effectively tied to Jared Goff, you could say probably for the next 2 seasons based on his contract. But I'll tell you, and this, the winner for me, and I have 2 winners in all of this, and it's Matt Stafford and it's Sean McVay. Matt Stafford going to a really, really good situation. It's been nothing but tumultuous in Detroit from, even pre Patricia and that whole scenario to the point to where Matt Stafford even said, I'll take a trade anywhere but the New England Patriots, which of course is where Patricia is now, which is just kind of wild. But, look, I think that he's a big winner out of this. He goes to a place that has an innovative look at offense, that's looking to be able to do more, that's looking to be able to take more shots downfield, as well as run the same type of a West Coast blend that he's been accustomed to throughout his career. So he gets to be that gunslinger in an offense that wants to throw the ball. So I think that that's great. And he gets, a little bit of an upgrade at the offensive line. He gets some good skill position players, I think. I mean, Cam Akers turned it on big time last year. You also look at the rest of the running backs they have and the way that they've been able to work out, but you also look at the young guys on the outside. You've got Cooper Kupp, yes, but you've also got guys like Robert Woods. You've got Van Jefferson out of Florida, who really started to come on at the end of last season. You've got a system that's comfortable using tight ends, which Matt Stafford has always done throughout his career as well. But the big winner for me, beyond even Matt Stafford, is Sean McVay. Sean McVay all of a sudden gets to unlock a whole other level to his defense that it didn't even, that it hasn't been able to have over the past couple of years with Jared Goff. And finally, Sean McVay maybe can do something a little bit different. We've talked about it here on the show before. And even Sosa, who has come through, host of Locked on Rams, has talked with us about some things that Sean McVay has been doing over the past couple of years. There's not enough variance, right? It's starting to get a little bit predictable because of the limitations potentially that came with Jared Goff. Now we'll see how true that is and if that's an absolute, factor in terms of what we've seen from the Rams offense as of late. And then if that ends up changing with Matt Stafford, and of course, both of these guys win with NFL's #1 defense from last year. They've got Aaron Donald on the other side. They've got Jalen Ramsey on the other side. They've got great players all over the place on this team. And I think that gives them a pretty good, getting Matt Stafford gives them a pretty good boost moving forward. So if we look at them now as continuing to be contenders in the NFC, how does this shake up and impact not only the NFC, but the NFL as a whole?
Well, I think it depends on the divisions. I mean, when you look at the NFC West, it's one of the toughest divisions in football. You take a look at Aaron Donald, the impact that he provides defensively. You look at the Seattle Seahawks with Russell Wilson. You have Kyler Murray on the rise there, obviously in that division as well. And you have San Francisco has a lot of questions as to who's going to be their quarterback of the future. Is it Jimmy G? Apparently it's going to be that way, but that division is very tough. When you look at, obviously, the NFC North, Chicago, Minnesota, Detroit, and Green Bay, as long as Aaron Rodgers is in that division, it's going to be hard, but can you find a way to be a little bit more competitive? And look, the thing about the Lions that stood out to me, over the past couple of years, they have competed with Green Bay. They have been in close games. They have been neck and neck. Outside of that, it's all about being able to stack on those wins down the stretch, and they just haven't been able to do that. So I think that if for Jared Goff for the Lions, they could have a better impact altogether. I think that if you surround him with some talent and you get him with a strong running game, which I absolutely believe they need to, then you might be able to win more games in that division. I don't think Detroit's too far off from being competitive, not necessarily saying going to the playoffs or anything, but they could be a competitive football team. For Matthew Stafford, it's that appeal. He's got a big arm. He's a guy, it's a former first-round pick. He can still compete. He makes that division even tougher, and he gives the Rams a little bit more of a semblance of balance there. However, can he run? I don't think he's going to be that sprint-out guy that can throw on the run. So I imagine when we see the reverse motion out of the Sean McVay offense, we're going to see a deeper drop back from Stafford, and he's going to load it up downfield. I think it's going to make those teams, better. But then again, I still look at the top guys in the NFC right now, Tampa Bay and their defense, and obviously Tom Brady playing smart, efficient football. Aaron Rodgers, those guys are going to be back in the race again next year.
Yeah, I still put probably Green Bay and Tampa Bay at the top of the NFC at this moment, right? We haven't seen all of the offseason play out. We don't know who's returning to teams, who's signing to new teams. We don't know what the draft looks like. But at this point, I would still put them up at the top. But look, we can certainly say that Los Angeles didn't fall off from its playoff run from last season. Some folks with strong opinions. The idea that the Rams are not an upgrade at O-line from Detroit is totally fine. I just look at looking at the numbers and things like that. I think maybe you can have that conversation either way. But certainly, when you look at the run game, you look at all the skill position players, you look at the defense. Even if you don't consider the offensive line an upgrade, you've got upgrades all over that team for Matt Stafford situation.
Even coaching too. You have an upgrade in coaching.
Oh, big time.
That matters. It really, really does.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the contribution too, because it's true. Even if you look at one thing as not an improvement, there's still all of these other pieces that most certainly are. Let's take a look now. The other quarterback trade that took place, Carson Wentz being traded to the Indianapolis Colts. The Colts now go from Phillip Rivers, who of course retired this offseason. We talked a little bit about his future Hall of Fame, as we hope, induction. But now they move over to Carson Wentz. And so how do we feel they look here? They just barely, 11-5 on the season, competing for the top spot there with the Tennessee Titans. Did they just create some distance in their division, the AFC South? And does Carson Wentz in this position get an opportunity to bounce back?
I think them and Tennessee are still going to be the two front runners, the favorites for that division. I think that Carson Wentz to Indianapolis is probably the best move for him. Ideally, he's entering a better situation. He's got a better offensive line in Indy. He's got some others. Now, there are some questions, obviously, with Costanzo's retirement at the tackle position. They're going to have to address that. But outside of that, you have Quentin Nelson, one of the most lethal maulers in the game. You have a strong running game, too, that, you can really build off of. And then, obviously, the emergence of Michael Pittman Jr. I like him a lot. I think he's going to be I think he's going to be a rising star here in the next couple of years. Now, the question is, who are you bringing back? Are you bringing back T.Y. Hilton? I think that giving a guy like Carson Wentz a vertical threat, a guy that can get past defenses like T.Y., I think would absolutely be necessary. If not, if they go somewhere else, I imagine they're probably going to make a little bit of run. They may even make a run at Deshaun Jackson. We could see that happen, reuniting those two. But I think for Carson Wentz, going to a situation with Frank Reich as his coach, again, is going to be better for him. Now, which Carson Wentz is going to come to Indianapolis? Is it going to be the shaken confidence guy that we saw in Philadelphia in 2020, or are we going to see the guy that we was having an MVP-like season under Reich before he tore his ACL? Those are the kind of storylines I'm looking at with this situation. But I think it's great for the Colts. I think it makes them stronger. Now, there was some talk already from some national heads that is he already in the MVP conversation? We haven't even seen a game yet, so I don't think we can get into that combo. But Carson Wentz will absolutely make the Indianapolis Colts a lot better, and especially with that defense, they're trying to rebuild that to be very stout as it was a couple years ago. I think they have the pieces to do so.
Yeah, I'll be really honest. I have always been at best lukewarm on Carson Wentz when it comes to Carson Wentz in terms of my expectations. But if there's a place that he could have landed this offseason in a trade to where he could later exceed those expectations, I feel like Indy's that place. I mean, you talked about the coaching staff. You talked about a competent front office, a very, very good front office, one of the best in the NFL that can continue to build around him, but one of the best in the NFL, in my opinion. An offensive line that has some really, really good pieces. There's certainly been a drop-off in offensive line play there as opposed to what we saw a few years ago, where they were arguably one of the best offensive lines. But even with that, you still have a lot of really good pieces there. You mentioned Michael Pittman, Jonathan Taylor, tailback back there, getting it done as well. There's a lot of really, really good pieces around there, as well as that young defense. Sort of like it feels akin to the situation we were just discussing with Matt Stafford, to where there are several upgrades around. Maybe some places that aren't, but there are several upgrades around Carson Wentz in Indianapolis that at least give him an opportunity there. And Indianapolis didn't seem sold on the idea of moving forward with Jacoby Brissett, and or they want to continue to use him sort of in the goal line situations, the close to the goal line situations that they were using him in with Phillip Rivers. Maybe it gives you an opportunity to continue to do that if you hold on to him. But at least now you have a pretty clear upgrade at quarterback. Still some question marks in terms of, can he be healthy, all these other things. And all of that is reflected in the trade compensation as well. For the Carson Wentz trade, the Indianapolis Colts gave up a 2021 third round pick and a conditional 2022 second round pick that can become a first if either Carson Wentz plays 75% of offensive snaps, or he plays 70% of offensive snaps and the Colts make the playoffs. So he could hit a little bit below that threshold, that 75% threshold, if the Colts hit the playoffs, and they can still, that pick still turns into a a round one selection in 2022. That's
a great deal, man. I mean, for them to be in that position, I would take that deal too. And I think for Carson Wentz too, the one thing I noticed when watching him last season, Ross, was I just saw a guy that was trying to do it all himself. I saw a guy that just tried to do way too much, and he ended up taking some shots and getting hurt. And look, that offensive line at Philadelphia, I tell you what, after that Washington football team, that first matchup they had where Chase Young just absolutely blasted them.
Yeah.
I started to have concerns because they look good in the first week, right? Everyone looks good week one for the most part. But outside of that, they started to pitter off a little bit. And that offensive line was a huge issue on the interior, on the outside. I mean, this is a guy that was the most hit quarterback in football in 2020. Right. And the fact that, he didn't even play in the final games and he still has it, I think speaks volumes. And he's definitely going to a better situation where I think he can really revitalize his career here. It's just unfortunate everything that happened. Look, he's got a Super Bowl out of it. He contributed massively on that team that season before he tore his ACL. So he has things to build off of. And I think that he can carry that DNA over to Indianapolis, who, look, I don't think they're very too far off, in the AFC. I think that they're there. They can compete.
Yeah, they should be able to. They absolutely should be able to. And we'll see, what Carson Wentz looks like in the system. Our good friend Benjamin Solak over at the Draft Network, as well as Locked On NFL Draft, which you can catch every Monday through Friday as well. Such a fun show with Ben and Trevor Sikkema over there. But Ben appeared on, I believe it was Mina Kimes' show, and talked a bit about what the issues are around Carson Wentz and who maybe not to buy in on just yet. And it's the guys that really operate underneath, the Paris Campbells, the Naeem Hines type guys that are there in Indianapolis, because Carson Wentz tends to not throw underneath and tends to be more of an intermediate to deep range guy. So we'll see, though, how much of that changes with the new leadership, the comfortable coaching situation that he's in. Can they get him to add that level of depth to his game to maybe maximize a bit more of what some of these playmakers can do with the ball in their hand in Indianapolis?
Yeah, you have to. I mean, the NFL it's an adapt or die mentality. Like, if you can't adapt to the current circumstances, teams aren't going to have a use for you. Me just seeing Carson Wentz, his body of product over, the course of the, last few years, I think he's absolutely capable of doing that. Heck, I think he should have invested in throwing the short route a lot more, because guess what? When you have so much pressure coming your way, when teams know that your offensive line in Philadelphia is one of the worst in the league, you have to be able to throw it short to the flats. You have to be able to run out routes, arrows, swing passes. You have to be able to get the ball quickly. You have to be short, intermediate, and then be able to take the deep shot. If you're just a type of quarterback that's looking intermediate, RPO stuff, and then deep, you're not going to be in the league too long, because defenses will figure you out. You have to always find a way to adapt.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That'll be the next step for them. Once again, everybody, we thank you very much for being here with us on today's episode of Locked On NFL Sunday. Glad to be here live with you. Cody Roark at Cody Roark NFL, myself, Ross Jackson at Ross Jackson Nola. Moving on to our next topic here. This was a pretty big one when this broke. Kind of the opposite situation of what we were discussing with Deshaun Watson, which happens when you're maybe a franchise quarterback, among other things. And J.J. Watt ends up being granted a release from the Houston Texans so that he is allowed now to pursue a new team. He can sign whenever he wants. Essentially, it's an early termination, which makes him a street free agent, but he seems to be taking his time. He even asked somebody on Twitter, hey, I'm going to take my time here. Like, let me take my time. But a couple of teams that have come up in conversation have already been not necessarily linked, but a lot of places that make sense for him to potentially land up. Pittsburgh Steelers, Baltimore Ravens, Tennessee Titans. And if you ask Peter Bukowski, it's already a done deal that he's going to be a Green Bay Packer, as well as a few other potential landing spots. Where do you think J.J. Watt ends up next season, whether it be by fit or by choice?
For me personally, I think it's between two teams, and I could be wrong here, but I think Green Bay, obviously with the Wisconsin home ties there for JJ, but I also think the Cleveland Browns are an intriguing area for him to go to, because think about it, he'd be playing opposite of Myles Garrett. And
right.
the one thing I'm looking at too when it comes to JJ Watt, there's reports out there that he actually doesn't want to play with his brothers, but he would entertain playing against them. And he'd be playing against them 2 times per year. I think J.J. Watt in Cleveland is very intriguing. Me personally, I think it's between Cleveland and Green Bay. But also, Ross, you mentioned something too I really wanted to touch on, because a lot of people were having this conversation on social media. I think it's the right conversation to have when it comes to Deshaun Watson and J.J. Watt. The difference between the two, Deshaun Watson just signed a massive contract extension. J.J. Watt had 1 year remaining on his deal. It's easier to part ways with him than it would be Deshaun Watson. And also, the Houston Texans were set to pay J.J. Watt $17.5 million in 2021. You factor that on top of the quarterback contract, I just don't think that was a position they wanted to even go to. And considering for a guy like J.J., who has overcome injuries almost every season, there's been times that his injury concerns have been something that has crept up. So it's easy to release a guy like J.J. Watt, and a guy that you drafted. And I also understand the sentiment too. Well, why can't you just grant Deshaun Watson what he wants? Well, because look, there's more years on the contract and there's also more money involved at the same time. So the difference between the two situations there, but yeah, Cleveland, Green Bay. I think Peter's got his hopes up, but Cleveland might sneak in though. I really do think Cleveland has probably the most appealing chance to snag him.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation between, like, if we look at Green Bay and Cleveland, if we just look at those sort of in sort of a vacuum, the interesting thing about both of them is that they're two entirely different situations. J.J. Watt goes to Green Bay to essentially be the number one guy on a defensive line, whereas he goes to Cleveland to be a guy on the number one defensive line, right? Like that's the mentality, is that he ends up playing a role with these other players. And don't get me wrong, you still have great pass rushers with the Smith brothers and particularly Zadarius Smith and Rashawn Gary as well in Green Bay. So he would still be a part of a defensive line there, but he wouldn't become the number one, I feel like, in Cleveland. Like that is all Myles Garrett's territory as far as I'm concerned. And so you end up adding yourself to, in either case, a defensive line that has a lot of compliments to you, that you complement, right? So there's a lot of different things here. I love the idea of him in Cleveland. And this feels very Cleveland, doesn't it? Like Cleveland continues to do this over the past couple of years where they're just piling on and adding pieces. Now, potentially they pile on and could add a piece over on the defense. That back end of the defense is going to get better when you have guys like Greedy Williams and Grant Delpit that are looking to get healthy. You've got a good group of linebackers there as well that can certainly improve, but you have a great draft of linebackers coming up. So you can continue to build the defense once you add that other premier pass rusher into the mix, and potentially even set up J.J. Watt in a situation where he can rotate a little bit, which helps to sort of prolong his effectiveness over the course of a potentially 17-game season as well.
Yeah, and I think it's appealing either way that you put it. Now, there's also another thing that pops into my head is, if I'm J.J. Watt, what am I thinking about right now? I mean, do I believe that there's a championship window in Cleveland? Because for me, I have to wonder how many more years do I feel like I can really give it my all in the National Football League, considering health, if I stay healthy. But also when I look at Green Bay, you know what? They were so close. They were in the NFC Championship game. They're the best quarterback in the game with Aaron Rodgers. I really want to win a championship before my career is over.
Right. How
do you determine in this situation where you go? That to me, I think is very is interesting. I would hate to be in his position there for JJ, but you have to factor those in. Is it about legacy and just the impact on the game, or do you really want to win a championship? I don't know if Cleveland's in a position yet to win a championship. I think they're going to obviously be a playoff competitor, but Green Bay's probably his best chance at a championship.
Yeah. Appreciate everybody coming through, especially folks coming in all the way from Scotland. Thank you very much for being here with us on today's episode of Locked On NFL Sunday. Yeah, I do think that has to be a big driving factor for JJ Watt, right? Remember, this is the guy that also walked up to Deshaun Watson near the end of the season last year saying, hey, man, I'm sorry that we wasted one of your years. Like, he has a very clear understanding of what the sort of peak is that's available in Houston. And it's probably not a championship right now, right? It would be an against all odds type of a situation. So if instead you have the opportunity here to go and sign with a competitor, get yourself that ring, get yourself a real opportunity, even though you've been the face of a franchise for as many years as he's been in the NFL, I think that there's something appealing to that, right? So maybe that is something that he's factoring in and allowing himself to say, okay, at least for this year or two, maybe before I sign another deal in another year or two, or what, however long that career continues, maybe that does become maybe the driving force behind where he goes right now this offseason.
Yeah, and I think that, you're going to have a lot of teams, and Ian Rapoport and Adam Schefter, they put out there that various teams, half the NFL has reached out to JJ Watt to inquire, right? I think that if you're a franchise and you don't at least reach out and say, hey, this is a situation, but what are you looking at? Imagine that you'd probably be, not in a very good position to compete. So I imagine half the league has said, hey, what's your asking price? I know there was a report over the last week that some teams have already offered him around $14 million to $16 million. What type of deal here's a little bit of a wild card too. Mm-hmm. If the Tampa Bay Buccaneers decide not to bring back Shaquille Barrett, do they maybe make a little bit of a run, maybe a 2-year deal, front load the money to JJ Watt, or maybe even just say, hey, what are you comfortable with here with what we have going? Because we guarantee you, we can get you to a championship. Then again, it's all about how can you sell yourself the best to one of the most dominant defensive players in the NFL.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. That's going to be such a big part. And everybody, look, the Houston Texans should be calling him and saying, what do we got to do to get you back? Like, everybody should be calling JJ Watt right now. And I very much believe that. So we'll see exactly how it all plays out, but it's going to be very, very interesting. You have a lot of teams that it's not surprising at all that a lot of teams with a ton of cap space this offseason had the fewest amount of sacks last year. Cleveland Browns included in that equation. Jacksonville Jaguars have the money to sneak in there and maybe compete as well. We know that they were, interested in other edge rushers last season, pass rushers last season. So, it's going to be one of those things. I feel like we can name as many teams as we want, but he's going to end up, obviously where he wants to, but it may be somewhere that we haven't even thought about yet. So we'll see exactly where he ends up for 2021. Cody, next up here as we continue and roll through, you mentioned his name just a moment ago. We have to make it so. You had a great conversation over at Locked On Broncos with Ian Rapoport. Why don't you give us some of the highlights of your discussion?
Well, I'll tell you what, Ian is always fun to talk to, a lot of insight as to what's going on. And one of the biggest topics, if you're a Broncos fan, you're tuning in this right now, you may want to hear this, but a lot of questions have come up regarding Von Miller. What are the Broncos going to do? Because the deadline for his club option is coming up very shortly. Do they decline it and he becomes a free agent, or do they work on restructuring a contract or coming up there? That is where the Broncos and Von Miller are at. Now, there hasn't been any contact made just yet. This is something that usually happens up until the final minute of the deadline. But the Broncos want Von Miller back. Von Miller wants to be back in Denver. My understanding from what Ian had told me is that they're going to work on making that happen. Obviously, there's a pending court case and stuff like that with the Parker Police Department referring it to the DA. But the Broncos have more information on that than we do at this point in time. So they're going to make that decision. But there's mutual interest on both sides there. And also in terms of the Broncos, we were talking about Deshaun Watson. A lot of Broncos fans want the Broncos to trade for Deshaun Watson right now. However, guess what? He's not available for trade. Now, Ian did say in our interview that if guys like Deshaun Watson or Russell Wilson do become available for trade by their organizations, one thing that they will do is that they will pick up the phone and they'll call and inquire. As of right now, the Broncos plan with George Payton, the new Broncos general manager, he's been in control of everything. They're more likely going to roll with Drew Lock into training camp, but they're going to bring in a veteran quarterback in free agency. Now, some names that people have thrown out this past week, Ryan Fitzpatrick. People have said that the Broncos have been in contact with Ryan Fitzpatrick. This is not true. This is all stemming from a retweet about 5 or 6 years ago altogether. If the Broncos had contact with Ryan Fitzpatrick right now, that would be considered tampering. And George Payton, one of the smartest executives in the National Football League with his experience over time with Rick Spielman, obviously in Minnesota, he's not going to tamper. Now, that's not to say that tampering does not happen in different conversations and contexts, especially, at the Senior Bowl where you're meeting with agents and, you have stuff there. You have conversations. But my understanding is that the Broncos will more than likely look at guys like Jacoby Brissett, Andy Dalton, potentially there, and even a Mitch Trubisky or, even a Gardner Minshew. Those are names that Ian Rapoport had thrown out to me as well to keep an eye on for the Denver Broncos to bring into competition for Drew Lock at training camp. And more than likely, that's what we're going to see.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about tampering too, just to make that clear for everybody. The fact of the matter is that if you are a player whose contract is expiring, it does not expire until March 17th, when the new league year begins. That's why that tampering window, legal tampering window, opens up on March 15th. The league doesn't even call it legal tampering. That's just what we all call it from the outside as we look at it. But that ends up being a big part of this equation of what went down between the Broncos and Ryan Fitzpatrick, right? Like, his contract is not officially over yet. You can see them maybe talking to some of these other guys whose contracts have already expired or were released, called street free agents, who are available at this time immediately, but not something that they could have done yet with Ryan Fitzpatrick.
Yes, that's correct too. And I think that a lot of people, Broncos fans right now are so focused on the quarterback conversation that it's either this guy, or I don't want any of it at all. Let things play out. Here's the deal with George Paton. He's a brand new general manager, even though he's been the assistant GM for many years in Minnesota. He's coming into a situation that I think he's probably in better shape than some of these other organizations altogether. There were people in the offseason saying that the Broncos are one of the most unappealing franchises for a new general manager candidate. And then all of a sudden, he's the first GM candidate off the board. And where does he go? He goes to Denver. So he's a smart, methodical guy. We've seen him already do things that John Elway wouldn't have done. I mean, John Elway probably would not have released A.J. Bouye or Jarrell Casey. He's already done that, and he's just trying to get the Broncos in a position, and his emphasis and philosophy is to build through the draft and develop young talent to building a sustainable roster in the future. Now, obviously that's the focus there. So there's a lot that the Broncos had to do with George Paton, and they believe that they're going to go into competition at training camp at the quarterback position, and then it gives them a chance to reevaluate things and then actually look at a long-term solution going into next season. And look, here's the deal. If the Texans don't trade Deshaun Watson here in 2021, I imagine if the quarterback situation in Denver does not work out this season for them, they will be all in on that next year. So there's also that. There's also Dak Prescott could be available as well in free agency. So Broncos fans, let's ride it out.
Yeah, let's give it some time. Shout out to London. Thank you very much for coming through today. Noah, we appreciate you being here with us on today's episode of Locked on NFL Sunday. At the moment, we're going through Cody's conversation with Ian Rapoport. Talked a little bit about the quarterback situation in Denver. He was extremely complimentary of that general manager hire in Denver as well. So it looks like maybe some positive, let's say maybe some positive trails ahead for Denver based upon what they've been able to do, or rather the hire in Denver. Anything else on the Denver Broncos from Ian Rapoport?
Well, he did mention that when the Matthew Stafford trade talks were there, they were in on Matthew Stafford. They were in on Jared Goff. They probably finished in the top three, but outside of it, this was a deal that was going to get done between LA and Detroit. Denver, they made an initial offer. Detroit responded with a counter offer, and they were asking for Jerry Jeudy. They were asking for Drew Lock and obviously some first-round picks. Denver said no. Denver was not willing to part ways with them, and Denver also did not offer Drew Lock to the Detroit Lions either. Detroit asked, Denver said no.
Interesting. So they were looking to add Matt Stafford, but keep Drew Lock on board over time. That's a really, really interesting tidbit, because it kind of goes to show you a little bit of the maybe trust that the organization has in Drew Lock's development. What other highlights do you have from your conversation with Ian, who was kind enough to join you over at Locked on Broncos last week?
Yeah, well, everything in the NFL offseason, it's expected to be mostly virtual. Once again, the NFL draft virtual as well. But there's some exciting news, I think, for fans that I missed it, but the NFL preseason is expected to be back now. Probably not going to be 4 games. Ian mentioned it could be 2 games. It could be 3 games. Those conversations are still ongoing right now between the NFL and the NFL Players Association. So some good news there altogether. Also, we talk about the TV broadcasting deal. They're still working on that. The NFL salary cap minimum right now is at $180 million minimum. That could rise up to potentially $193 million altogether if, in fact, some of these TV deals do come into fruition. That could boost, obviously, what some organizations can do in terms of salary cap restructuring, negotiating of contracts, and whatnot. And I think that's going to be something that we have to keep an eye on here in this next week. I imagine a deal could be happening by the end of the week. That's just the hunch that I have. But obviously, Disney's the holdup right now in the regards to, obviously, ABC, ESPN, Monday Night Football. But then again, look, this is a perfect opportunity for other products like Amazon to come and sneak in and maybe get a little bit of that broadcasting deal there. So obviously a lot of interesting developments, but for the NFL, preseason will be back here in 2021.
Yeah, that's a really, really great tidbit, especially hearing that the salary cap could potentially be up around 190, even maybe exceeding that. What a huge development it would be to go from being down nearly $20 million this season to being down only $5 million this season after not being able to have fans in the stands last year. With everything going on with the COVID-19 pandemic, that would be a really big victory for a lot of teams. I can think of one in particular that would be very happy about that. But I mean, that would be a really, really big development and open up the opportunity for a lot more flexibility for even the free agents that are on the street, because a dropping salary cap affects not only the teams, but it affects opportunities for players that are out there and their ability to be able to sign longer term deals or even just heavier 1-year deals. I think it was Chase Edmonds, I believe, who was on Twitter not too long ago mentioning that he was curious to see if it's going to be, who of course is an NFL player, mentioning, if it's going to be a lot of mercenary for hire kind of 1-year deals so that people can get back on the market next year when the salary cap is expected to sort of explode if things get back to normal, if the 17 game season happens, and if these TV deals happen. We're looking at some big boosts later on down the line in the salary cap. So all of that really, really fantastic information, and something to continue to keep an eye out on, especially as this offseason continues to kind of hang in the balance. No announcements yet made about the salary cap officially in terms of what it's going to be. A lot of things still kind of hanging out before free agency opens up on the 17th of March.
Yeah, and rightfully so. And look, it's going to get wild. I've been telling NFL fans this on my social media feed for a while. Like, hey, get ready. You better make sure that your airbags are good. You better make sure that your steering wheel, is tightly intact, and make sure that your seatbelt is locked in. Because, dude, this offseason, Ross, I feel like this has the potential to be one of the craziest off seasons that we've ever had in the NFL in quite some time in the last decade. I think it's going to be absolutely crazy. I think we might see a couple of surprise trades leading up to the NFL draft. Maybe not at the quarterback position, but I think we're going to see more trades executed now more than ever. And as it pertains to the salary cap, it's really interesting as well. You mentioned that the kind of the mercenary for hire. How many players would take a 1-year deal to essentially go to a team and maybe create sort of like a super team like we've seen the NBA do? I don't know, in the long-term best interest of players, I don't think that's going to happen. I think the NFL salary cap is there for a reason. I mean, this isn't the MLB. This isn't the NBA. There's 11 players on a field. And look, you want to have, 11 good players, but you can't go out and just spend all this money to bring in the most elite guys for 1 year. I mean, essentially, you might be able to, but I just don't think it's very likely.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it makes perfect sense. By the way, if you need any help with the airbag, the seatbelt, or the steering wheel there, you can check out rockauto.com, of course. Big time supporters of the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, Cody, why don't we get to some questions here from the chat? We had a couple of things that came through over time. I feel like this is all 100% in your ballpark. Pat Shurmur's offense outdated. Of course, if you have any other questions or comments, go ahead and drop them here as we begin to wrap up the show. We'll get to all of your questions. You can drop them wherever it is that you're watching, or you can comment over on or reply on either one of our Twitters at Cody Roark NFL, or you can at me at Ross Jackson Nola.
Well, to this question, I think this question in general, in specific, a lot of it I think is really subject to a lot of groupthink, because there's certain blogs or certain outposts that'll say, well, the offense is outdated. But here's the reality. Okay, if you want to go on my YouTube channel, Cody Roark NFL, I literally break down the Broncos offense and defense from week 1 all the way to the final week of the season. We see the progressions that the offense has made. Now, at the first half of the season, I think we really saw Pat Shurmur's offense be Pat Shurmur's offense. Now, towards the mid part of the season, when the Miami Dolphins game rolled around, when they came to Denver, we started to see Pat Shurmur adapt his offense to the skill set and to the personnel that Denver actually has, to what Drew Lock could do really well, and also the wide receivers, the tight ends, the running back, and the offensive line, because the offensive line was just changing. I mean, you had different guys playing different positions. You had, tackles being out. You had new players on the O-line almost every other week at the mid part of the season. You had to do with what you can only do with what you have there. And also to factor in that this is a brand new offense that was installed over Zoom, where they never really got to work on it. The first time they were able to do it was essentially in training camp, and you're limited in what you can do in training camp. So the first real test that these guys have seen in the Pat Shurmur's offense came week 1 against the Tennessee Titans. So Pat Shurmur's offense, there's things that I was very critical that he needed to adjust on. I don't think it's outdated, though, in my opinion. I don't. I think that narrative is really laughable, because we hear it regurgitated from these various places that really haven't been watching the film. So that's kind of my frustration. But hopefully you guys can check out my film and see a little bit more about that and kind of make that observation on your own.
Yeah, definitely go and check out Cody's YouTube page at Cody Roark NFL. I guess you don't need the at on YouTube. I'm so used to Twitter. Cody Roark NFL. He does some really, really great film breakdowns over there. Nelson Nakatsu, thank you so much for your questions. Now we're going to get to some pulled pork nachos. Good friend of mine over on Twitter. Appreciate you coming through. How would the Saints community feel if they had Jared Goff on board? Bad. Let's go to our next question. No, but truly, I don't think that the Saints. I don't think that the Saints community of fans, knowing that there's having some hope that Russell Wilson becomes available, knowing that Jameis Winston is definitely an option, even knowing that the mobility of Taysom Hill is very exciting. I just feel like the brand of football that Jared Goff would bring, not even in terms of just talking about the game, but just talking about the sort of fan community around that, I think that they would prefer maybe a little bit more of a new element to the offense, extra elements to the offense that I don't think Jared Goff brings you. And knowing that he had struggles picking up Sean McVay, or at least let me say it this way, the speculation around him having struggles picking up Sean McVay's offense, Sean Payton's is no easier at all. So that's
the only guy in the world that knows Sean McVay's offense is Sean McVay. Sean McVay. Everyone else is just trying to figure out. Okay, he said this. He said something like X crisscross Z laser. Okay, bam. This guy's going to run across. Okay, it makes sense now. All right, bam. Sean McVay dreams about it. He's got the schemes up. I mean, if you could see the subtitles in Sean McVay's head, we would all be like, "What does he think he's going to be?"
But, it's like entering another dimension, but not being able to fully understand that dimension or comprehend that dimension at all. Here's a big one for you. This is coming from Mel Marks. Leave Drew backup quarterback. I believe it's Alex Smith, Fitzpatrick. Use the money to fix other keys. I believe that Drew gets it now. Excellent show. Hey, thanks for the compliment. We appreciate you. Thank you very much for being here. Couple of different plans in here that you can maybe pick from.
Yeah, here's my thing, Mel. My stance would be, listen, look, there's Broncos fans that dislike him. I'm not a fan. That's why I'm not a fan. It's great. I don't have to pick and choose sides. But for me, I think the Broncos' best option is to bring in a veteran competition in training camp, push him. If Drew beats that guy out, great. Look, you give him 2021 to see what he can put on the table. Can he improve? Can he avoid making those same mistakes he made in 2020? His decision-making was arguably one of the biggest issues. Obviously, with some technical stuff in terms of his footwork, stuff that can be improved upon and worked on. Now, obviously, if those changes don't happen in 2021, if he does beat out the veteran that they bring in for competition, well, then look, I think it makes your decision easier to say, hey, look, we gave him 2.5 years, 3 years to be able to be the guy. We're just not sold. We have a new GM, new regime. We're going in a different direction here. We're going to find the best option available for our franchise at quarterback. And if the veteran comes in training camp and beats Drew Lock out, well, then you roll with the veteran, and then you have that same exact analysis. Like, hey, okay, look, now we have to really address quarterback after this season. The Broncos aren't in a rush to really just sell the farm to be able to do that. And a lot of people think that, you can get a guy like Deshaun Watson for a couple of first-round picks and a player or two. No, it's going to be a lot. It's going to be a lot of capital, 3 first-round picks, 2 second-rounders, 2 third-rounders, and more than likely 2 key players. That's way too much, in my opinion. That's just my opinion. I respect your opinion if you think otherwise, but I think the Broncos' best bet, roll with Drew Lock, bring in a veteran. If Drew beats him out, great. See what he has in 2020. If not, bam, then you can reset.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's another one, Broncos related here. What are your thoughts on Mel Kiper's latest mock draft with the Broncos trading back with the Patriots for a 2 and another in 2022?
I think it really depends on what the Broncos envision. What they do in free agency, I think, is going to be the biggest tell. Now, right now, you take a look at defensive line. They released Jarrell Casey last week on Thursday, so I think you have to make the decision. Can we fulfill the defensive end spot? That means that do the Broncos re-sign Shelby Harris or DeMarcus Walker in free agency? That's certainly a possibility. Taking care of Justin Simmons, that's a key need. Denver does need a cornerback, and if you're picking there at pick number 9, you have a legitimate chance to either get a Patrick Surtain or a Caleb Farley, or if you do trade back, maybe a J.C. Horn out of South Carolina. I think Denver would be in great hands regardless with either of those 3 players, but I don't think that – I don't know. I wouldn't trade back personally. I know that getting additional capital is always great, and maybe it might be appealing depending on what the Broncos do in free agency. If they sign a cornerback like a veteran like Patrick Peterson or another guy in free agency, then yeah, I think I would entertain that.
Absolutely. I think at some point, right, everybody's got a price. Every team's got a price. You know what I mean? Everything has that price. So if they find it, then I think that's That's going to be the biggest part. All right, we got another couple of questions here from Twitter. So let me grab those real quick, and then we'll wrap up today's show. We appreciate y'all always being here with us for Locked On NFL Sunday. We will be back next Sunday to talk about and catch up on all the other news that takes place over this week. I'm sure as we get closer and closer to free agency, now we start seeing more of those cuts, the Jarrell Casey cuts, more of these other things. And of course, Saints fans still waiting on an announcement from Drew Brees. Is he returning? Is he retiring? Hopefully we'll get some news on that next week and be able to get some of that info here on the show. Now we're going to jump to Brian Riles at Brian Riles on Twitter. Would it be better for the Saints as a whole to re-sign Jameis Winston and not trade off some of the young talented building blocks? Look, here's the way that I look at it. That's probably more likely what's going to happen because, again, Russell Wilson not asked to be traded, not demanding to be traded, currently not on the trade block considering that. Brandon Marshall said back at the beginning of February that the Saints had called Seattle about Russell Wilson. I don't know how true that was or if that's been confirmed, but that was something that was mentioned on, one of the talking head shows out there. But when it comes down to brass tacks, he's not available at the moment, as it seems. He's not at least publicly available. The Saints right now not going to be making any decisions until Drew Brees officially announces whether he's retiring or returning. You won't see any other quarterback news that's officially coming from the organization before that. That would be kind of disrespectful, I think. And so I think all of that taken into consideration, it's always better to hold on to all of your pieces and have a guy that has been on your team the year before, has learned your system. I think if you have the ability to maximize that, that's great. If you have the ability to move for Russell Wilson and not, give up the things that make your team effective around him, that's also great. But to me, what seems most likely, Jameis Winston in the black and gold next season being the starting quarterback for the New Orleans Saints.
Yeah, I see that happening too. I mean, you and I've had this discussion. I think probably every week this past season. But I do really believe that Jameis Winston probably is going to be that guy. And based on what Sean Payton has told him, various media people, it makes it seem like Jameis Winston probably is the guy that is going to take over for Drew Brees when he does announce his retirement. Who knows right now, Ross? Drew Brees could be coming back tomorrow with a new press release saying, "I'm back."
Who knows?
Then what would that mean for New Orleans, right? So I think that Jameis Winston is probably the most realistic option for them. And look, he's had a whole year to really kind of learn behind Drew a little bit, learn the process, learn the offense. I think that puts him in a better position. And then he could still use Taysom Hill in the way that he's designed. But I don't think Taysom Hill is really that guy that you can just line up at quarterback for, 17-game regular season and have the success that you had altogether with the Saints previously with Drew Brees. I just don't know if that's going to be the case. Yeah,
Taysom Hill's love for contact alone makes me nervous about him being a 17-game starter, right? You want him to be able to play his brand of football, play his style of football, which is what makes him so effective. I think that having both of those quarterbacks is better than having only one of those quarterbacks. Either way you slice it. Next up, this one is from Ambi303 on Twitter. Going to talk about Fitzpatrick possibility to Denver, and if so, does he become the starter? So let's say that Ryan Fitzpatrick does end up in Denver at some point. What are the chances that he becomes the starter, or does it turn into more of a Miami Dolphins to a Ryan Fitzpatrick type of a situation?
I think it turns more to the Miami Tua situation here because Drew Lock's progression, he's evolved. He's played better. He's gotten things, obviously, he needs to work out in his game. He's not necessarily, when you watch him play, the worst quarterback in the NFL. You can make the argument for a couple guys there. When it comes to Fitzpatrick, look, Broncos fans were complaining a couple years ago when Joe Flacco came in. It would be just the same exact thing you'd be getting from Ryan Fitzpatrick that you got from Joe Flacco, an older quarterback that has that veteran experience, has won some big games. However, mobility is a big issue, I think, in and of its own right there. So you want to bring in a guy maybe like Fitzpatrick. If you wanted to bring him in and have him just be a mentor to Drew Lock, absolutely, that would be great. That's not what Ryan Fitzpatrick wants at this point of his career. He was really gutted over what happened with the Tua decision because the Dolphins offense, they were actually playing better with Fitzpatrick than they were with Tua, and they made the decision to still go with him. So I don't think that Fitzpatrick would come to Denver with that situation. I don't know if he'd beat Drew Lock out.
Yeah, there's also that, right? It's still a competition. And we've talked a couple of times about this, the advantage of already knowing a system and how that alone puts you up there. But, lest we forget, Ryan Fitzpatrick went to Harvard, so maybe he can learn it pretty quickly.
He's a smart guy, man. You know what? I like that. When he wears polos, he unbuttons all three buttons, and he's got the whole Conor McGregor look, the glasses, the beard. Dude, the beard is magical, right?
Oh yeah, we all know.
But the last time we saw Ryan Fitzpatrick in Denver, he threw a game-sealing interception to Justin Simmons.
Ah, well, there you go. Yeah, you certainly don't want to miss out on those opportunities if you're Justin Simmons.
Fitzmagic or Fitztragic. I mean, that's what Dolphins fans have told me. He's got two names. It's either it's going to be Fitzmagic or he's going to be like, oh my gosh, it's tragic. You know what happens. But yeah, I think he's a great veteran quarterback, but I just don't think he's going to be in a position to come into a young football team right now and just be the guy that's going to elevate them to the next level. Drew Lock is going to be getting Cortland Sutton back, Albert Okwuegbunam alongside Noah Fant. And then who knows what kind of decisions are going to be made on the offensive side of the ball regarding Phillip Lindsay and even the running back position. So I think Denver's got some optimism on the offensive side of the ball. However, can Drew Lock make better decisions? That's what it's going to ultimately boil down to. Can he show that he's the guy? If not, bam, Denver's got their easy decision. And then Broncos fans will be happy after that. If it works out for Denver or if it doesn't work out with Drew Lock, I think that closing of the book, I think would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, let's get to our last question here. It's from Mahler8 on Twitter at JScott875. What is your best guess on the cost to get the number 3 overall from Miami? So I have a couple of different scenarios that seem to make the most sense to me because I think that it's a high price to get that number 3. And we could talk about this from any and all teams in this NFL draft. I think that depending upon what happens with the Carolina Panthers at the quarterback situation, if they don't, they're pursuing a new quarterback. It has been mostly public at this point that they're clearly looking for a replacement at quarterback. Matt Rule got a really good look at some of these quarterbacks at the Senior Bowl. There's a potential of potentially moving up from 8 to 3. They're in a really good position to be able to do that and then maybe land their future franchise guy or somebody they think could potentially be their future franchise guy at number 3. They would be a team that I would watch. And also, I know that they're at number 4, but we've seen this before with the Atlanta Falcons at pick number 4, knowing that they could potentially be jumped for a quarterback at pick number 3. They could potentially also move up that one spot. We've seen San Francisco do this in the past. We've seen other teams do this in the past to make sure that they get the guy that they want and that they don't get leapt for their quarterback. So I think that the price starts with a top 10 pick and then basically builds from there.
Well, you mentioned the 49ers doing that. Remember when the 49ers, I believe it was the Chicago Bears, if I'm not mistaken, remember they just fleeced them? Like they made them think that they were going to trade up, and they forced Chicago to give up all these assets in order to do it. That's the conversations we had. That's just it's like a game of chess. That's what I love about the NFL draft that not a lot of people really focus on. But I mean, that's an appealing position to be in at number 4 because a lot of people are talking about there could be 4 quarterbacks taken in the first part of the NFL draft. Literally picks 1 through 4 could all be quarterback. I am not on the assumption that's going to happen. But then again, Carolina, they've been freeing up a lot of that cap space to try to make a move. So I think they might be all in.
Yeah. They should be all in at that position if they feel like Teddy Bridgewater is not the guy, because outside of Teddy Bridgewater, there's not really any options on that roster. I mean, you've got potentially the guy's name from PJ Walker. So you have PJ Walker there behind Teddy Bridgewater, but we got a good look at him week 17. That didn't go over very well. Of course, he came in relief, which is very different. But Matt Rule is probably going to want to take a look at quarterback, and so he could potentially end up moving up from number 8 if there's a guy that he really, really likes up there in that top 3.
Teddy back to New Orleans.
I wouldn't be mad at it. I certainly wouldn't be mad at it if the Jameis Winston thing doesn't work out. Did you watch this week's I Am Athlete? I did.
With Cam Newton.
With Cam Newton, yeah. I
feel like we got a different side of Cam Newton I don't think I've ever seen before. Just the open, honest conversation about what it's like going from Carolina to New England, where you do it the Patriot way. Look, to be honest with you, look, if I'm the Broncos, I would inquire about bringing in Cam Newton to compete with Drew Lock, because guess who the quarterback coach is? That's Mike Shula. Guess who Mike Shula used to coach Cam Newton? Maybe, I don't know. I mean, Cam Newton, I think definitely still could play football. It really depends on this offseason and what NFL teams are and what players are allowed or not allowed to do as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been such a pleasure. Just double check to see if we have any other questions that came through on Twitter. I think we're all good. I think we've hit everybody. So we appreciate you as always for joining us here on another episode of Locked On NFL Sunday. We'll be back next week. Once again, this is Cody Roark. I'm Ross Jackson. You can follow us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Ross Jackson NOLA. Don't forget to check out all of the great shows across the Locked On Podcast Network. We're so grateful to be back here on Sundays and so grateful for all of your support. We appreciate you for tuning in. Cody, take us home, man.
Oh, hey, like Ross, you said it best. We bring you extensive coverage all year long of what's going on around the National Football League. Your favorite team, we get you involved in the show. You can only get that here